civilizations, old and new, are this man's province. The 5,000 centuries of recorded time, his span. 10 volumes comprising a study of history, his life's work. The National Broadcasting Company presents a conversation with the distinguished British historian, Professor Arnold Toynbee, and Christopher Wright, teaching fellow in Harvard University.
They'd have to be much farther away, wouldn't they?
Oh, it would. It'd be out at Hendon or somewhere, but I think we shouldn't very easily find it, even in a legend.
No, I don't imagine anybody wanted him.
Well, as a matter of fact, we can't spend very much time on end away in the country, so we have to make do with the country and the town, and that's one of the advantages of London, because here you have it. When I look up from my work at my desk here, I always catches the green of that tree and that bud there down in my own garden down there. It's a curious thing, you know, about where one's roots are. I know very well that my own roots are here in London. And I suppose that's because, as a child, I grew up here when I was very small. Of course, I don't mean to say that I haven't got a feeling for places in the country. Well, Christopher, you remember that part of Yorkshire where you and your family came to visit me once between the wars. I've perhaps a greater feeling for that than I have for London. I have a great feeling for places in Italy or Greece, but London somehow is a place where I have to do the main part of my work, I always find.
Now that your book on the study of history is finished, and it's quite a few volumes now, I suppose you wrote most of that here then, didn't you?
Well, I did write those 4 volumes over there since the war, here in this room in London. At least most of them. I wrote part in Princeton, New Jersey, and quite a good bit on the ocean, going to and fro. Now, these 6 other volumes, I wrote most of them up in Yorkshire, which we were talking about just now.
How long did it take you to write it all together?
Well, it took me 27 years, because out of that came a bite of 7 years bitten out by the Second World War. But it's amusing to think of. When I'd got my notes all written out, I thought that I'd polish it off in 2 summers. It took me 27 years.
You know, I've often wondered, just how did you get started on this enterprise?
Well, I think the explanation is really my mother. Not that she suggested it, but she just was an historian herself, and I grew up assuming that I was going to be one too because of her. Here's her picture. No, it's always on my desk, looking quite young. She was in one of the first class of women to take a university course at Cambridge, England. And when I was small, she used to put me to bed at night. She used to tell me the history of England in bits till after about a year we found we'd gone all through it.
I seem to remember you referring to some other members of your family, too. Some uncles, weren't there?
Oh, yes, there were. There was my great-uncle Harry, for instance, and the ship captain.
Oh, yes.
He put the world on the map for me, with Cape and India and China and all the oceans of the world. Such a contrast to Uncle Paget, who was a very precise scholar. I remember his sending for me when I was about 16 and telling me I ought to specialize, but deciding straight off I was going to do that. Anyway.
It's quite a variety in your family, then, isn't it?
Well, I suppose the family name is best known to my Uncle Arnold, whom I was named for, who died as a young man at about 30, and the first settlement in London was Toynbee Hall, founded in memory of him.
But with all the variety in your family background, it's interesting to figure out just who was the main influence. How'd you become an historian? I suppose it was your mother's influence, wasn't it?
I'm sure it was my mother, but of course, at one stage anyway, that was rather overlaid by my school, because I went to a very old-fashioned school, Winchester, founded at the end of the 14th century. And they had what was then a very up-to-date 16th century classical education, which I still came in for. Translating bits of English into Latin and Greek. It's rather surprising how what seemed like rather a narrow form of education did broaden one out there. Now, Emerson, my master, thought that Emerson was just the thing to translate into Platonic Greek prose, so that introduced Emerson to me.
That's an interesting idea, how even a very specialized schooling can lead to a variety of interests.
Well, yes, it does. For instance, yes, I'm thinking of Herodotus. I had to translate an awful lot of Herodotus out of the Greek when I was at school. There's an old Greek historian writing in the 5th century BC, and he becomes a sort of second Uncle Harry to me, opening up quite a large amount more of Asia for me. Why, I was so interested in reading Herodotus at school that I had a sort of childish drawing book, and I wrote an essay and illustrated it too, all out of Herodotus.
Do you still have that book?
Well, yes, I have. As a matter of fact, it's just here behind me.
Could I see it? I'd like to.
Well, you certainly can. Here we are, 1903. I must have been about 14 years old when I produced this. Xerxes' Guardsman.
They're very fine. You were 14 when you did that.
Yes. It's a funny thing, you know, but if you look at volume 7 there, and one of the annexes, you'll find a sort of essay on Xerxes' army, which grew out of this childish essay here. Minus the illustrations. I afraid they couldn't reproduce theirs.
No. What's this?
Oh, that's still earlier work of mine. I don't know how old I was, but about 7 I did that. Battle of Naseby. My mother interested me in English history, remember?
But all the figures have animal heads. Why is that?
Why, so they do. I remember it because my mother had been reading Uncle Remus to me at the time, and I was thrilled with Uncle Remus. So somehow the soldiers at Naseby all turned up in my drawing with animals' heads, all taken out of Uncle Remus' illustrations.
In your youth, you really lived in the past a great deal then, didn't you?
Well, I did, I suppose, but funny thing is that the past then led me back into the present. Oh, I'm thinking of my first visit to Greece. That was in 1911, the year before the Balkan War. Now, I went to Greece just to study ancient history. I had no notion of the modern world, and that visit to Greece for ancient history, well, it put the modern world into the center of the picture for me. I remember.
How's that?
Well, I remember on the boat going to Greece. There was an American my own age, and he'd already done half a dozen different jobs and earned enough money on the side to go around the world with. Now, that made an impression on me. I thought I was unspecialized compared to my Uncle Paget, but I was pretty specialized compared to that young American. Then I could think of walking about in Greece, spending the night in a Greek village, going to the village store and listening to the men talking. They were talking about something called the foreign policy of Sir Edward Grey. I never heard of the foreign policy of Sir Edward Grey in England, but they were talking about this, my own foreign minister, in connection with some war that was coming either this spring or next spring. Well, now, that surprised me a lot. I'd never heard of that in England, but it put international affairs in the picture for me. It was my first lesson, really, in international affairs.
How'd this come to be of use to you in your career?
Well, I mightn't have used it, I suppose, if the First World War hadn't come along. The Greeks knew it was going to come. But as I'd been traveling in Greece and Turkey a bit and seen something of the modern Near East, I was taken into the British Foreign Office. I'd had dysentery in Greece and couldn't serve in the army. And I landed up at the end of the war in the Foreign Office delegation to the peace conference in Paris. And
You never did get back into purely ancient history then, did you?
Well, by that time I was really straddling between past and present. On my way to the Paris Peace Conference during the war, I worked for Lord Bryce, James Bryce, you know, the author of the American Commonwealth. Now, he was a piece of education for me because here was a great historian who was also a great statesman, ambassador, man of affairs, and he fused past and present together. I noticed that.
If I'm not mistaken, you went out to Greece then as a correspondent, didn't you? There again, more action.
Oh, yes, I did. I made another shot at that. Rather on the modern side this time. There'd been a new professorship of modern Greek founded in the University of London, and I was appointed to that. But of course, that took me to Asia again because the Greeks and Turks after the First World War were fighting a war of their own in Asia Minor, and I wanted to have a look at that. So I went back. I had to pay my way, so I became a correspondent for the Manchester Guardian newspaper. That got me rather into trouble because, well, you remember, some pretty nasty things happened. I got into political complications over that, and that took me out of my professorship and landed me up at Chatham House.
Of course, Chatham House, being an institute of international affairs, really has kept you involved in the current scene, hasn't it?
Well, so it has, of course, that annual survey of international affairs that I've done for 30 years past now. But, of course, that leads you back into the past because you have to see current affairs in depth, and that means in the historical setting. That may take you back 10 years or 100 or several hundred sometimes. You never know what won't be relevant.
Well, that's true, but how do you manage to do both these annual surveys, which themselves amount to a great deal of effort, and also to produce this enterprise in the study of all history?
Oh, well, the answer to that is my partnership with my wife, because during those 30 years, she and I have done that annual survey together. We're working still on History of the War in the same series. That's my explanation, a very sufficient one. It's been a perfect partnership for me. Second, I suppose, is a certain amount of self-discipline. One has to learn if one means to do one thing, one can't do other things. Now, our bus we come home by every night takes us past the Albert Hall in London, where they have those concerts, and we often feel ashamed when we see the young people coming back from their work, stopping off to go to a concert without having supper, and, well, we feel we're a bit older and we're just too tired. We've got to give that up. It's a lot to give up, but you have to do it that way.
That's true. But still, couldn't it be argued that your study of history is the kind of thing that could have been done by a group of... Why'd you have to do it all yourself?
Well, now, I don't believe a committee can write a book. There are all kinds of things a committee can do. It can govern a country, perhaps, but I don't believe it can write a book. I think a book has to be written by some single mind. And, of course, that's a very large and formidable undertaking. And I think if a writer is wise, he gets all the help he can from other people. Responsibility is on him. It must pass through his mind, but he takes help where he can get it. I learned a good deal about this from writing our Survey of International Affairs and then applied it to the other book, Study of History. Learned how to get your critics' opinions on your work before you publish, when it's not too late to change, instead of waiting till they review your book and slate it. I applied that quite a lot to parts of the study where I felt I was out of my depth or where the ground was particularly delicate. And then I'm thinking of all the wonderful work in detail that's been done in recent times by not only our historians, but by the Orientalists and by the archaeologists, how enormous the amount of use I've made of that. So I would say that one man must do it, but if he's sensible, he'll take help where he can find it.
You don't think there could be any single definitive study of history, then, would you?
Oh, no, I don't, because history is always on the move. The other day, reading my newspaper and following what Mr. Dulles and Mr. Eden were doing, I had my other eye on what the archaeologists were doing, because they were turning the history of the second millennium BC upside down by uncovering a new ancient site in Anatolia. It was moving almost faster than the 20th century was.
You mean, then, history really is an accumulation of past experience for modern-day use?
Yes. History not used is nothing. After all, intellectual life is action like practical life, and if you don't use the stuff, well, it's might as well be dead.
From what you say, it sounds as if you couldn't have done your study of history without your work on current affairs at Chatham House.
No, well, after all, the only time you can catch people alive is your own time when you're living. If you can catch them alive there and study them in the life, well, then perhaps you can bring them alive in 1000 BC or 2000 BC. But if you can't study living people and know what they're like, you can't study human beings at any time.
I understand the personal element in any historian's analysis of history, but there must be a scientific element, too. Discovery of some patterns.
Well, now, that's a point people get pretty excited about nowadays. As you know, there's quite a dispute about that. I suppose by science one means a discovery and understanding of regularities and uniformities, recurrences, what the scientists call laws. And some historians just deny that there are any such regularities and uniformities in human affairs. They say, as you know, history doesn't repeat itself.
Yes.
I'm rather a heretic about that. I believe that it partly does repeat itself. I believe you can discover a certain number of uniformities in past history. At the same time, I'm not a determinist. I don't believe we have no free will, and I don't believe past patterns just foretell and foredoom the future. I think there's an element of freedom and an element of pattern, so probably I don't satisfy either party.
Mr. Toynbee, just what is your theory of history?
Well, that's a large question. Well, I suppose I started off by finding I couldn't work with the nations as units of historical study. And most people in our time work with nations. I found them too small and felt they were somehow fragments of something bigger, which I had to reach after. So I reached after civilizations. For instance, not seeing things in terms just of American history or French history or Italian history, but seeing it in terms of Western history, and then again Greek history or Indian history, so on, these large units, about 20 of them. And then I began to study their anatomy and their life history, so to speak, and I found, as I thought, that a number of them had broken down and gone to pieces, and that had happened to them on a certain pattern. But now that didn't make me a determinist, because it didn't make me believe that is bound to happen to every civilization, such as ours, which is still alive. But it did make me feel that there was a great challenge to any civilization that showed the symptoms of breaking down, as ours clearly does today. But I do believe that we are free to a very large extent to settle our own fate. But I didn't end with civilizations, because when you study the breakdowns of civilizations in the past and collisions with one another, you find yourself coming to the origins of the great religions of the world: Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, and so on. And in these last volumes especially, I've come to the conclusion that it's really the great religions that are the ultimate patterns in history and that probably have the future. So I started with civilizations as my first key to unlock the secrets of history, if one could unlock them. And I've come on to a second key, which I think takes one further, and that's the great religions.
How does one discover or characterize a civilization? Is there some special element that distinguishes one civilization from another?
Well, I started by working outwards from these national units and saying to myself, they're not complete in themselves. You can't understand American history from just America. Now, what's the smallest unit from which you can understand America? And that carried me to what I call the Western world, Western Christendom, really, that part of the world which, only a small part of the world, but much larger than any single nation, which has the same manners and customs, the same tradition, the same religion and way of life. I mean, you can't understand American history without knowing something about Western Europe, but you perhaps could understand it without knowing very much about India or China or the Mohammedan world.
What kinds of attitudes are they that bind a civilization together?
Well, thinking of our Western civilization, I suppose it's our feeling for individual liberty, what you might call the sacredness of the individual personality. The Indian civilization, it might be a kind of otherworldliness, feeling that all material success and achievement is a kind of illusion, and the real thing is something beyond, which seems rather different from our point of view. Chinese, a great feeling for family relations and tradition. You get a kind of style, so to speak. I think Spengler uses that word of civilizations, and distinguishes them.
These feelings bind a civilization together, but then why should a civilization decline or decay?
Oh, I suppose because of the original sin in human nature, to use old-fashioned terms, and the imperfection of human affairs. Everything human tends to break down. We're always living dangerously and always have to be on our guard. Eternal vigilance is the price of everything achieved by human beings.
Do you think then of civilizations as a kind of a living organism that's bound to die?
No, I wouldn't think of it like that. I think that's perhaps a false analogy. I know many people have made it, but I don't think a civilization, which is after all only a great network of relations between organisms, between individual human beings, is the same thing as an organism. And I think while we know that any single organism must die sooner or later, it doesn't follow that a system of relations must die.
And yet you found that civilizations have
died in the past, yes. Yeah. But that again doesn't make me believe in fate or doom. I've noticed, for instance, they've had very different lengths of life. Some have lasted just a few hundred years, some 1,000 or 1,500.
What sorts of characteristics would those be that make the difference between, say, a short and a long-lived civilization?
That brings me back to this phrase of mine, or rather Robert Browning's, challenge and response, that I think every moment of each of our individual lives and every moment in the history of a civilization are always being challenged by some new situation, to face it and either succeed or fail. And any moment we may fail and begin to go under, or we may succeed and go on living.
Where does our civilization stand now in relation to your analysis? In other words, just what is the challenge of our time, and what might the response be?
Oh, well, I'd say the challenge was, are we going to let ourselves go the same way as all those other civilizations in the past that have broken down and gone to pieces? We can see a lot of symptoms of the same thing. I think above all, war getting out of hand. We know what that meant in the histories of those earlier civilizations. Must we let that happen, just fold our hands and let it go, or can we do something about it? I believe that's a challenge. I'm personally an optimist in the sense I believe we have the power to save ourselves if we choose to do so.
I suppose then, in terms of avoiding war, catastrophic war, the real challenge is for the United States and Russia to avoid war.
Yes, it isn't easy with the whole world drawn into just two camps and two great camps only, and then armed with these atomic weapons. I see something new there. We never had weapons of that destructiveness before, and I see something hopeful there too. That I do think that though often in the past new weapons have been invented and they've had terrible effects, I've never known in history of a new weapon which made such an effect on people's imaginations as the atomic weapons have on ours. I think people all over the world in millions have realized that the conditions of war have changed. I think that is a sign of hope.
And far from being a sign of doom, then, the discovery of atomic energy gives you cause for encouragement?
Yes, we're going through a very difficult and dangerous and anxious time, obviously, but I don't see signs of just inevitable doom.
With your study of history on such a cosmic scale, I wonder just how the individual relates to these civilizations you talk about.
Well, that's quite a point, isn't it? Because if one looks back over history, there are very few individuals who've obviously, well, made history, as people say. I'm thinking of Mr. Churchill in 1940, when he writes that he felt himself walking with destiny. What he meant was he really was himself personally shaping things. And yet, I believe myself that all individuals do make history, really. Well, Mr. Churchill might have given the lead, but if 50 million men, women, and even children in Britain hadn't followed him, that lead would have led to nothing. So we all, in different degrees, do count in history. After all, individuals are the only realities in history, aren't they? There's nothing else except relations between human beings. And if history isn't made by human beings, it's not made by anything else. Everything that's made and unmade, that's sort of created and destroyed, that succeeds or fails, I think comes out of individuals.
Seems to me, though, you've also defined challenge in terms of religion.
Well, yes, I do believe that any challenge, when it gets down to the quick, when it puts you really up against it, brings you face to face with religion. And I think we've been rather taken unawares over that in our Western world, because after all, about 2 or 3 centuries ago, after those wars of religion, we fought against each other, Catholics and Protestants. We got pretty tired of religion. It seemed to lead to nothing but war and strife and hatred and uncharitableness. And we turned away to other things, to science, technology, as being, so to speak, safe occupations, innocent compared to religion. But I believe human beings can't really live without religion. And when you come against hard times, and we're living in spiritually hard times, then religion confronts you, and you have to grapple with it. Of course, what one means by religion is awfully difficult to state, isn't it? I think I'd say, I mean, the mystery behind the things we can handle and touch, behind the phenomena, as we call them, and not just becoming aware that there is a mystery, but feeling pretty humble in face of it and wishing to get into contact with it and into harmony with it. If you take religion in that broad sense, that's what I really mean by it. I think, of course, that if we do come back to religion, we shan't come back to it in the form in which it was when we turned away from it, because things never repeat themselves like that, and all the experience we've been through and the things we have learned will enter into our new view of religion, I would say.
You've already managed to learn so much, Mr. Toynbee. I've often wondered just where you thought the limits to our comprehension might be.
Well, now, speaking just for myself, I hope I may have learned, well, just enough to know the limitations of my own knowledge. After all, the more we learn, isn't it true, the more we realize how narrow our knowledge is. In the physical world, we see it stretching away to the infinite in one direction and to something infinitesimally small in the other. And isn't the spiritual world like that too? Because the psychologists are showing us an infinite world inside each one of us, and then the great religions have shown us an infinite world outside us. I come back to what I suggested before, that we get back that mystery behind the phenomena, and if we approach that with humility, that brings us back face to face with religion.
From what you've told me, you wouldn't be surprised to see your study of history outdated in the future, would you?
I'm sure to be outmoded. I look on my notions as, well, keys, really, for opening up a vista of human affairs. I think they're good keys as far as they go, and probably really do unlock doors, but every tool has its own purpose and its own limitations. I think, well, history is moving very fast nowadays, as we've said, and also what I hope to do, partly as a result of my book, is to provoke other people to enter the same field of inquiry, and the more people work in that field, the faster the earlier people's ideas will be changed. I take it as a sign of success if my own personal work was superseded. It's just a bucketful of water thrown into the river to make an infinitesimal difference to the flow of water there.
Are you planning to carry on your study even farther, or do you have other projects for the future?
Oh, well, I have other projects, yes. All the things I haven't done because I was doing this rather long book over this number of years. I've got some work on Greek history and on Roman history that I was planning before the First World War, which I'm going to finish off now. Then again, my study and the general growth of interest in this panoramic view of human affairs has started quite a lot of discussion and criticism, which I hope will increase, and that's going to lead me to reconsiderations of my own ideas. Probably that'll turn out into form for another book, perhaps.
Seems to me that your faith in the future really belies your being described as a prophet of doom.
Well, you know, Christopher, I believe that life is action. It's action or else it's failure. I suppose that's pretty obvious in the case of practical men of action. But I'm sure it applies just as much to people like you and me, to scholars, philosophers, historians. Like the rest of us, we have to do just the best we can with the time and the energy that we have in one lifetime, and life is short. You know, during that long time when I was writing that book of mine, I heard in my mental ears two verses of an English poet. He wrote 300 years ago, but his words are just as much alive today. It's Andrew Marvell's lines. But at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near. Therefore, well, therefore go to it.